Let's talk about say-do ratios. Your say-do ratio is the ratio of the things you say you're going to do to the things you actually do. Different people have different interactions with their workload, and as a result have different say-do ratios. Up front here, I'm going to say that I have a pretty strong bias towards doing what you say, towards not overreaching and delivering on the task that you committed to. But as we go through this, I want to try to be as unbiased as I can be and try to explain why, to some degree, all of these different ratios can be beneficial under certain circumstances. I'm also going to assume that the amount of work that you're actually delivering is acceptable. One of the ways you can manipulate your say-do ratio is by promising very little and then delivering very little. So first, let's talk about cases when somebody's say is way higher than their do. This means that they are promising a lot, taking on a lot of work, but they're not always delivering what they say they're going to deliver. Why is this happening? Could just simply be happening because they're underestimating the amount of work that things are taking. This is very common for programmers throughout their career, but especially when they're fairly junior. Things feel like they're not going to take very long, and then they end up taking way longer than they expected. Or they forget phases of work that need to be done in order to get something completed, and they only consider the very initial standing it up, not the iteration, not the bug fixing, not all of that. That's more of a maturity thing. That's something that you can expect people to get better at. You can provide them training, you can provide them support to help them be better at estimating the length of time that things actually take. It can also happen for two less innocent reasons. Certain managers actually love ambitious people. So in those cases, it's actually to your benefit to say that you're going to do a ton of stuff, because they're not necessarily going to follow up and see if you actually delivered on what you promised. So you end up in situations where people who dramatically overreach are actually praised for that. They actually are benefiting for overreaching, for overpromising, and the amount of delivery they have isn't ultimately mattering. The other reason why you can see that say-do ratio fall out of whack with a lot more say than do is in cases where people want to do more than they actually can afford. They might actually know they can't afford it. They might know that it's way more than is possible. But by promising to do it in a smaller length of time, they put the project in a situation where they're kind of trapped by what was promised, because other decisions were made based upon the assumption of delivery. And now you have no choice but to finish the thing that's going to take 2 or 3 or 10 times as much work as was originally committed to. This can get really dangerous because you are making decisions based upon what was being promised. And now you have a situation where you almost have no choice but to follow through, even though the estimates were completely out of whack. If you have people with dramatically higher say than do, it can be very difficult to plan around them. What do? Do you plan around them delivering everything they say they're going to do? Then you end up trapped in this situation where you are holding the project hostage based upon decisions you've made based upon what was promised, and now you are wildly short of that. You may find yourself in a situation where you are forced to make dramatic changes to the game to recover from promises that were not remotely delivered upon. The more intricately connected the parts of your project are, the earlier in the pipeline that this person lands, the bigger the impact of this misalignment of say-do ratio can be. If I'm responsible for delivering the tool that everyone is going to use to write all the conversations, then you are going to plan around what I said in terms of delivering that tool. You might believe me when I say this tool is going to let writers write 3 times as fast. So you don't ramp the writing team up until very late. And then when my tool doesn't remotely do what I said it was supposed to do, when that tool comes in 6 months late, you find yourself in a situation where either you're going to have a writing team way bigger than you ever expected, way bigger than you ever planned for, or you find yourself cutting writing, cutting story, because your plan didn't account for this. Even for people who land really late in the process, this misalignment of say-do ratio can really be a problem. If I'm right at the end of the cinematic pipeline and I'm doing the final lighting, and I promised a level of fidelity that I simply can't deliver upon, well, you find yourself in a tough situation. Do you ship these cinematics that were built around the assumption that the lighting would be able to carry a bunch of the storytelling burden? Or do you back up to an earlier phase of the pipeline, rebuild the cines, now knowing that the lighting can't do the job that was promised? If I'm failing to deliver in a timely manner, if I'm promising a speed I can't deliver, well, not every project can afford to go late forever. You might find yourself forced to ship with lighting that is incomplete. While it can be catastrophic at the very early phases of the pipeline, even at the very end, it can have huge impacts to your delivery date, to your quality, to the other departments, because it can force content to have to go backwards in order to accommodate for the lack of delivery from something that you promised. And unfortunately, on some projects with some leaders, that person that promised the world and didn't deliver it isn't the one that ends up bearing the brunt of the consequences, because they might have written a check that someone else ends up having to cash. I want to say that someone with a dramatically unrealistic say-do ratio eventually gets their comeuppance, but I've seen with certain managers that people can get away with this effectively indefinitely. Their managers so much like the ambition that the fact that they aren't following through isn't catching up with them ever. Now, one positive you can get from a highly ambitious say-do ratio is that in some circumstances, it can actually cause more work to get done. Even though you're not delivering everything that you promised to deliver, that ambition, that reaching, can under some circumstances cause more than you would otherwise have committed to get done. This is shoot for the stars and hit the moon, where you aim intentionally further than you might be thinking you can do in order to pull yourself as far as is possible. The problem, again, though, is you can't really plan around this because you don't know what of the things that were promised ultimately are going to get delivered. So ambition can be great. Even really long-reaching ambition can be great because it can cause more to get done than otherwise would even have been attempted. But the lack of ability to plan around this can be really problematic, especially in cases where you are affecting other developers, other departments, other parts of the project, which in most games these days is almost everyone. Almost any feature is going to drag in more people. So if I'm promising to deliver the moon, I'm writing a check for somebody else as well as myself. If I'm perfectly isolated, if I'm unconnected to the rest of the project, then my ability to deliver can be largely mitigated. We can work around this. We can say, well, he promised to deliver 65,000 different hats, but we've built the game in such a way that it doesn't really matter how many hats he delivers. We'll just work around whatever he has, and there's no real work on the rest of the project if he only delivers 65 hats instead of 65,000. But that's pretty rare. Most of the time, you are going to plan around that delivery schedule. If I promise 65,000 hats, even if the project is being conservative, they might say, okay, great, let's build the UI to handle thousands of hats. Let's build the economy around the fact that we're going to have thousands of hats. If I deliver 30,000 hats, that might still be okay. If I deliver 60 hats, then that's a problem because the game is assuming the existence of these thousands of hats. And now we have to go into the rest of the game and change the economy and change the UIs and change the drop schedules of different equipment. And maybe now we put burden on people who are building other items because I promised a huge number of hats and failed to deliver. In the flip side, when my do is a lot higher than my say, it means that I'm promising almost nothing, but I'm delivering a lot of stuff. In some cases, I'm actually delivering more than I'm promising. This is essentially Scotty from the old Star Trek show, where he's saying something's going to take 2 weeks to do, and then he's delivering it in the next 3 minutes.
Do you mind a little advice? Starfleet captains are like children. They want everything right now, and they want it their way. But the secret is to give them only what they need, not what they want.
Yeah, well, I told the captain I'd have this analysis done in an hour.
How long would it really take?
An hour?
Oh, you didn't tell him how long it would really take, did you?
Well, of course I did.
Oh, laddie, you've got a lot to learn if you want people to think of you as a miracle worker.
This feeds into my biases. I love these people. But it also has a lot of problems. Just like when my say is way higher than my do, it's very hard to plan around. If I say this system is going to take 6 months to do, then we might not do it at all. Or we might mitigate around how long it's going to take. And then when it shows up 2 days later, we've built plans around the fact that it wasn't going to be delivered. We've restructured the game around how long this was going to take. Again, we've shifted burden onto other groups. We've decided that this is still worth doing, but we've restructured around this delivery. If I'm sufficiently out of whack with my estimates, with my promises, that essentially I'm saying this is going to take forever, then the project is forced to adapt to that. And it is problematic as well. If we were thinking, why don't we build an automatic hat system, and then when we go to someone to get an estimate for that, they come back with something really large that is much larger than reality, then we're forced to decide to do something. We might decide to cut hats completely. We might decide to add 15 hat designers to the project rather than pursue the automated hat system. When we have these overblown estimates, we still have to react to that. It's still causing incorrect behavior in order to respond. So why do we end up in this situation? Again, it can also be a lack of experience, especially a lack of understanding with systems. People who have a little bit of experience, they start to understand that things take longer than they expect. Sometimes they can overcorrect to try to cover that misunderstanding, that lack of estimation ability, and you can end up with estimates that are much too large. Especially when they're moving into systems that they're not fully familiar with, they might build in a lot of extra buffer. The other thing it might be an indication of is they are having difficulty understanding requirements. I talked about this in the past where they might be giving you the price of a motorcycle when all you wanted was a bicycle. And as a result, they're saying it's going to take a ton of time, when the reality is once they fully understand the mechanisms of what's going on, they realize it's way easier. That's relatively innocuous. You can work around that. You can adjust to some degree as the estimates get better, as the people get better at estimating. But you can have this happen for, again, less innocuous reasons. If I know my manager very much punishes a failure to hit my targets, then I'm incentivized to pad my targets as much as possible to avoid blame. In pretty much the mirror image of the manager who rewards ambition, if my manager punishes failure, then I'm going to really push my say down in order to avoid under-delivering as much as possible. The other thing that happens is the FU number. The FU number is, I don't really want to do this feature. I think it's stupid, or I think it's going to be boring to work on, or I don't like it for whatever reason. So when you ask me for an estimate, I blow that estimate completely out of whack in an attempt, consciously or not, to essentially try to price it out of existence. Again, in that situation, what can happen is that the game then has to adapt to a feature that is shown to be way too expensive and has to cover the need that that feature was supposed to cover in some other way. One dangerous thing about someone whose do is higher than their say is what often tends to happen is that that's not actually a stable state to be. What actually often tends to happen, assuming that they're not just getting better at estimating as time goes on, if they're doing this for some other intentional reason, is that what often ends up happening is actually their do just starts to decline until it's basically in line with their say. So over the long period of time, the Scotties of the world often end up in situations where they're underperforming, not because their say-do ratio is out of whack. In fact, it tends towards 1, but because the entire magnitude of what they're delivering starts to decline. Because rather than their say go up to match their do, often what happens is their do goes down to match their say. The ideal situation that you want as much as you can is for your say and do to be in perfect harmony. 100% of what I say I'm going to do, I do. I don't do more than what I say. I don't do less than what I say. I do exactly the same amount. I'm promising as much as I can, and I'm doing as much as I can, and they're in perfect ratio. It's not really practical because you don't always know the specifics of what you're going to be working on. Things change. Teams are intricate. There are consequences. The difference is the subtleties in that say-do ratio when it's near 1 are very dependent on situation and manager. I like that do to be as high as possible, that say to be as low as possible, but that's not universally held. Most managers are going to actually want you to be pretty close to 1, but there are people that have blind spots, have preferences, can be manipulated by throwing the say-do ratio out of whack in either direction. While I would like to say that people will get caught eventually, in my experience, that's not always what happens. Indeed, a strong storyteller who is able to promise a lot and explain away their failures can often rise pretty high within an organization, as long as they're able to not take the blame for a failure to deliver, either because their failures go unnoticed or because they're able to place that blame on someone else. You see the say-do ratio coming up in the way that people talk to the public as well. Someone like Elon Musk has a very high say-do ratio. His say is quite a bit higher than his do. He promised autopilot for the Teslas for years. It's going to be next year for year after year after year. You could argue that in his case, he is reaching really far to try to pull the technology forward. And as a result, the technology moves faster than it would otherwise have moved, even though it's never quite lining up with where his reach lies. I don't make a judgment call there, but if you're going to try to paint that in a positive light, that's how you would go about doing it. Within games, Peter Molyneux is famous for promising all kinds of things on stage, most of which didn't exist when he said them out loud. Some of them come into being, some of them don't. So he is, again, arguably pulling the game forward through what he promises. But he's not delivering on everything that he says he's going to. So for some people, it's very off-putting because he's overreaching. He's making promises that aren't being delivered. Some amount of PR when you're in development is going to be about promising things that you think you're going to do, but may ultimately fail at doing. And that's the nature of the beast. If you want to see cases where the say-do ratio is a lot closer to 1, it's usually cases when PR in a game starts a lot closer to when the game itself actually launches. And in that case, you have a lot more confidence in what you're actually going to do, what the game is actually going to be, so you're less likely to make promises that are not actually being paid off by the game itself. Again, assuming that the amount of work being done is appropriate, there are 3 possible states. The person is promising more than they are delivering, the person is delivering more than they are promising, or the person is delivering about what they are promising. That third one is the easiest to deal with, the easiest to plan around. Within those 3 criteria, different managers, unfortunately, prefer different balances, even though they may not realize it. So you may find that the best thing for you as an employee is to adjust your amount of say in order to fit into the biases and desires of your manager as best as you can. What I would try to avoid doing as much as possible is don't adjust your amount of do, keep that as static as possible, shift the amount of say to fit into what your manager is looking for. They may not even know what they prefer. They may not actually realize that they love people who overreach. But usually you can see it based upon the people that they call out in meetings, the people that they seem to gravitate towards. So pay attention. There are opportunities here. If you are someone who's managing people, yeah, you really want them to be as close to even as you can, because that's what's going to allow you to build schedules that actually make sense, to plan your project in a way that actually makes sense. As I said, my bias is towards people who have a high do and don't overreach. But ideally, you do want them to be in balance as much as you can. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. If you're interested in picking up some merch, there is a tag in the video for that as well. This is the High Tea on the High Seas t-shirt. That also helps support the channel. We have a Patreon as well if you're interested in joining that rather than joining as a channel member. There's a link to that in the description. What is your experience on this? Do you feel like you need to overpromise to get your manager to agree and then you just beg for forgiveness after the fact? Do you underpromise because your manager is punishing failure? What are some strategies you've used to mitigate this and mitigate the fact that different people expect different things? Let's talk about that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.